Chapter 9. San Francisco greeted Alexander with a cold familiarity that unsettled him more than any foreign city ever had. The air smelled the same as he left it, salt from the bay, faint metal, something electric that always clung to the fog, but it no longer felt welcoming. It felt grotesque in its normalcy, as though the city had gone on breathing while his life had quietly collapsed elsewhere. As he stepped out of the airport, the weight of the past months pressed down on him all at once, thick and unreal, like waking up from a fevered dream that refused to fade. He stood still for a moment, suitcase in hand, watching people hurry past him with usual urgency. Families moved together in clusters, children tugging at sleeves, laughing too loudly. The sight hit him harder than he expected. Max should have been here. Max should have been asking questions about planes and engines and whether clouds could be touched. Instead, Alexander was alone, carrying a body that felt older than it had been weeks ago, moving through a city that now reminded him of absence more than home. The ride back felt longer than usual. Every familiar street carried a strange distortion, like a memory replayed at the wrong speed. When he finally reached his house, the silence inside it felt aggressive. There were no scattered toys, no half-finished drawings left on the coffee table, no soft noise of movement in the background. The place smelled faintly stale, untouched. Alexander stood in the doorway longer than necessary, his chest tightening as the reality of it settled in again. This house had become a shell. He set his bag down slowly, as though any sudden movement might make the emptiness worse. The couch still held the indentation where Max used to curl up beside him during movie nights. Alexander ran a hand over the fabric, then stopped himself abruptly, standing up too fast. He could not afford to linger. Grief, he had learned, expanded to fill any space he allowed it. He checked the time, exhaled, and pulled his phone out. Arian answered on the second ring. "You're back," he said, relief audible even before the words fully formed. "I landed an hour ago," Alexander replied. His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "I'll be at the lab in about an hour." There was a pause just long enough to register. "Good," Arian said. "We need to talk." Alexander hung up without asking questions. He didn't trust himself to hear too much before grounding himself in something physical, routine. He moved through the apartment mechanically, setting water to boil, choosing a tea he hadn't touched since before everything went wrong. The familiar motions calmed him briefly. As the steam rose, he straightened his shoulders, forcing himself into the version of himself that survived. He stood in the kitchen a moment longer than necessary, hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug as steam curled up towards his face. The tea tasted faintly bitter, each sip slowing the frantic overlap of thoughts in his head. The quietness of the house pressed in on his ears, and he let the warmth travel through him before setting the mug down with care. He rinsed it, wiped the counter out of habit, then moved through the house with deliberate precision, pulling on a jacket, checking his phone, steadying his breathing. Whatever grief waited for him here would still be here when he returned. Right now, there was work to do. He locked the door behind him and stepped into the familiar San Francisco air, already shifting himself into the version of Alexander who could function, analyze, and survive. By the time he stepped into the lab, that version had fully taken over. The lab lights were achingly white and precise, a sharp brightness that tolerated no ambiguity. Arian was already there, standing near the central console, arms crossed. He looked tired, more tired than usual, but his eyes sharpened the moment Alexander entered. They didn't hug, they never did. Instead, Arian gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said, "you look like hell." Alexander allowed himself a thin smile and sat. "I've had a complicated few weeks." Arian studied him closely, then bowed. "You don't have to tell me everything." Alexander did carefully. He spoke of legal delays, of hostility, of being pressured without naming names. He mentioned fear without dramatizing it. He spoke around the worst parts, trimming the edges off the truth until it was something manageable. Arian listened without interrupting, his expression shifting between concern and restrained anger. "I'm sorry," Arian said finally, "about Max." Alexander swallowed and bobbed once. "Thank you." There was a brief silence before Arian turned to the screen and brought up a series of graphs, logs, and cascading lines of data. This, Arian said, is why I asked you to come as soon as you landed. Alexander leaned forward instantly. I started noticing anomalies about 10 days ago, Arian continued. There weren't any breaches in the usual sense. No alarms went off, no failed login attempts showed up, and nothing looked suspicious on the surface. Still, something had changed. The system isn't behaving the way it was designed to. However, it is really subtle, almost invisible, like someone had interacted with it without leaving any clear trace. Alexandra's grip tightened on the armrest. What do you mean, changed? Arian hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The patterns are off. Response times don't line up the way they normally do, and the way data moves inside the system has lost its usual balance. It's not obvious, almost easy to miss, but it's too precise to be an accident. Alexander stood abruptly. Show me everything. For the next several hours, time dissolved. Alexander worked in a trance, moving from terminal to terminal, pulling historical data, reconstructing all patterns. Lumiere's architecture unfurled before him like a living organism. Entanglement chains, redundancy layers, probabilistic storage nodes designed to collapse traces rather than preserve them. And yet something felt off. Nothing in the system was actually damaged or hacked, but it felt like someone had been quietly watching how it worked. Alexander started breaking the data down into very small details, tiny timing mismatches, response delays that kept repeating in a pattern instead of randomly, quantum states, resolving a split second later than the models predicted. On their own, each of these things was meaningless. Taken together, they suggested malicious intent. Arian pulled up deeper logs and started cross-checking everything against outside factors: power supply variations, scheduled maintenance, background system noise, even temperature fluctuations in the lab. One possibility after another was ruled out. No malware signatures, Arian said. No unauthorized commands coming in, Alexander replied. No persistence either, Arian added. Whatever touched it didn't leave anything behind. By the time they looked up again, 8 hours had gone by. As they sat back down, exhaustion weighed heavily on both of them. Alexander rubbed his face, staring at the screen like it might confess something if he stared long enough. I can't recover what initiated it, Alexander said quietly. Whatever touched the system didn't leave residue, Arian frowned. That shouldn't be possible. That's the point, Alexander replied. Lumiere wasn't accessed in the way systems are accessed. It was brushed against like someone tapped the surface of a pond without breaking it. Arian leaned back, thinking. Let me ask the obvious questions, Alexander acquiesced. Could this just be the system slowly changing on its own, Arian asked, like small errors building up over time? Alexander shook his head. If that were the case, things would look messy and uneven. This doesn't. Everything is still too evenly aligned. Arian thought for a moment. What if one of our test systems is interfering, something experimental? I locked all of those off, Alexander said. They're completely separate. They shouldn't even be able to see the main system. Then maybe it's a hardware issue. That would leave obvious signs, Alexander replied. Perhaps some random glitches. This remains static and looks like it's controlled. Arian leaned forward. So what are we missing? Alexander hesitated. Someone looking at the system without touching it. Arian blinked. You mean spying? Not directly, Alexander said. More like someone figured out how to tell the system is there by watching what doesn't happen. Arian's expression darkened. So they know Lumiere exists. Yes, and they're being careful, Arian added, studying it without setting anything off. Alexander bowed slowly. Exactly, and that's the problem. They sat in silence for a moment, the sharpness of the noise from inside the lab filling the space between them. This wasn't the kind of problem you fixed by rewriting code or adding safeguards. It meant someone out there was patient, intelligent, and already several steps ahead. The thought made his stomach tight. Arian rubbed his palms together slowly, a nervous habit he hadn't realized he had picked up until now. This isn't some random curiosity, he said at last. Whoever's doing this knows exactly what they're looking for, and they're taking their time. He glanced at the monitors, then back at Alexander. That's what scares me. Alexander acquiesced, jaw set. Which means we can't afford a single mistake. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, trying to steady himself. Between Max, Kazakhstan, and now this, everything was colliding at once. Lumir was no longer just a project, it was a target. And for the first time since he'd begun working on it, Alexander felt something close to fear, not of failure but of being found. "So, what do we do?" Arian asked. Alexander leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "I will harden it," he said, "by making it harder to profile." Arian waited. "I'll randomize execution timing across nodes," Alexander continued. "Right now the system is too consistent. Anyone watching long enough can build a behavioral fingerprint. I'll introduce controlled jitter micro delays that look like normal system noise." Arian nodded slowly. "That breaks pattern analysis." "Exactly." "I'll also rotate internal routing paths every few milliseconds instead of keeping them fixed. Even if someone maps part of the flow once, it won't be valid again." "And the data itself, I'll fragment it further," Alexander said. "Smaller shards, shorter lifetimes, nothing stays resident long enough to be reconstructed. If someone's observing externally, all they'll see are incomplete transitions. If someone's watching passively, they won't know which signals matter." Arian exhaled. "Does that actually stop them?" Alexander shook his head. "No, it just raises the cost, time, computation, uncertainty, enough that they make mistakes or reveal themselves." "That's not much of a safety net," Arian said quietly. "It's the only honest one," Alexander replied. He stood, already mapping the changes in his head, aware of what this meant. Lumir had crossed a line. Someone had detected its behavior without touching it, which meant they understood what to look for. That was the dangerous part. Whatever had begun following him here wasn't reacting, it was studying him. By the time Alexander left the lab, the city had already shifted into night mode. San Francisco always did that quietly. He stood for a moment outside the building, laptop bag heavy on his shoulder, feeling the familiar ache settle into his spine. 12 hours of sustained focus had a way of hollowing a person out. The changes were in place, at least the first layer of them. He'd rewritten scheduling logic, introduced jitter into execution cycles, fragmented data persistence windows until nothing stayed alive long enough to be meaningful. Still, the unease followed him all the way home. His house again felt too quiet when he stepped inside, empty in a way that pressed on the chest. He dropped his bag by the door, kicked off his shoes, and moved through the rooms without turning on the lights. The kitchen counter was clean, the couch untouched. Max's room, still exactly the way he'd left it before Kazakhstan, caught his eye as he passed. He didn't go in. He poured himself a glass of water instead, leaned against the counter, and let his thoughts run. Someone had observed Lumir without interacting with it. That alone narrowed the field. Passive observation at that level required access to infrastructure most people didn't even know existed. Backbone routing visibility, large-scale telemetry, long-term signal. Aggregation. Not a lone hacker nor an academic curiosity, and definitely not random. He replayed Arian's questions in his head. All the possibilities were ruled out. The deviations had been too consistent, too intentional. Someone hadn't broken in. They had stood outside the fence and measured the shapes. This meant they were patient. Alexander slept badly because his mind refused to disengage. He kept drifting awake, checking the time, listening for sounds that weren't there. When morning finally came, it felt abrupt, like a system reboot forced without warning. He dressed quickly, barely tasting the tea he made out of habit, and left for the lab earlier than usual. The first sign that something was wrong came before he even sat down. Arian was already there, standing at his workstation, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the screen. "You're early," Alexander said. "So are you," Arian replied without looking away. "That's not why I'm here." Alexander set his bag down slowly. "What happened?" Arian finally turned. "We've got activity." Alexander felt the shift immediately, the internal recalibration, the narrowing of focus. "Define activity. Read only interactions," Arian said. No write, no command execution was detected, but the system state was sampled. Again, Alexander crossed the room in 3 strides. That shouldn't be possible. "It shouldn't," Arian agreed, but it happened between 3:10 and 3:14. Alexander pulled the logs up himself. He scanned quickly, fingers moving almost automatically now, parsing timestamps, correlating execution paths. watching the system replay itself in abstract. The changes he'd introduced were still there, the noise was intact, the routing paths had rotated exactly as designed, and yet. There, Arian said quietly, pointing. Alexander saw it, a cluster of timing correlations that shouldn't have lined up. Someone had compared expected randomness against actual output and found structure where none was supposed to be visible. They didn't breach it, Alexander said. No, Arian replied, they measured it. Alexander leaned back in his chair, heart rate climbing despite himself. How? That's the problem, Arian said. Whatever they're using, it's external. They're not inside our network. They're looking at effects, not causes. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. This wasn't about Lumiere's code anymore. It was about the environment around it. Someone was watching traffic patterns upstream, the kind of metadata that only becomes meaningful when you have visibility across multiple systems at once. State-level visibility. That's not a startup, Arian said, voicing what Alexander was already thinking, and it's not an individual. No, Alexander agreed, it's an organization. And one that knows what to look for, Arian added. Alexander opened a new window and began pulling comparative baselines, historic runs, pre-modification behavior, post-modification variance. The result was subtle but undeniable. Someone had adapted faster than he'd expected, faster than they should have been able to unless they already had a model, he said quietly. Arian's jaw tightened. A theoretical one, or a partial one, Alexander replied, something close enough that they recognized Lumiere the moment it went live. The room felt smaller now. The hum of servers louder. This was the merge he had been dreading, even if he hadn't named it yet. Kazakhstan hadn't been isolated. The intimidation, the surveillance, the forced pressure to leave, it all felt surreal. Someone had learned who he was, what he worked on, and decided leverage was easier than negotiation. Arian spoke carefully. Do you think this is connected to everything else? Alexander didn't answer right away. He thought of Sarah on the plane, the precision of her questions, the way she'd framed Lumiere not as an invention but as a tool. He thought of how quickly interest had escalated from custody disputes to threats, from legal obstruction to physical danger. Yes, he said finally. I think it's all the same pressure, just different angles. And now, Alexander stared at the screen, now they're confirming something. They don't know how Lumiere works, but they know it exists, and they're trying to figure out what it can do without tipping their hand. Arian swallowed. Can they? Eventually, Alexander said, everything leaks given enough time. The question is how much they learn before we change the rules again. He began sketching out next steps aloud, less for Arian than for himself, but even as he planned, he knew it wasn't enough. This wasn't a race he could win by hiding. It was a race about control, about who would reach him first with an offer he couldn't refuse or a threat he couldn't ignore. His phone buzzed on the desk. He froze. It was just a calendar reminder, a meeting he'd forgotten to cancel. Still, the reaction told him everything he needed to know. His personal nightmare, the loss of his son, the manipulation, the fear was no longer running parallel to his work. It was intersecting with it. Whoever was watching Lumiere now wasn't interested in the technology alone. They were interested in him. In what he would do when cornered, in how far he could be pushed before he broke or bargained. Alexander closed the logs and stood. We shut down external exposure completely, he said. For now, Arian nodded, and if they escalate. Alexander looked at the dark reflection of himself in the monitor, tired, older, and sharper. Then, he said, we stop pretending this is just research. Outside his lab, the city went on as usual. Inside the lab, Lumiere pulsed quietly, invisible to almost everyone. Almost. Alexander didn't allow himself the comfort of panic. Panic wasted time, and time was the only thing he didn't have. If Lumiere was being watched from the outside, then hiding it further wasn't enough. It needed to change its behavior in ways that meant something only to him. He decided the next phase wouldn't be about defense alone, but about control and misdirection. If someone was measuring its activity, he would give them the wrong outline, a version of Lumiere that looked valuable but incomplete, powerful but constrained, enough to keep interest fixed away from the real core. He sat back down, rolled his sleeves up, and started working. He forked the system quietly, separating what Lumir appeared to be from what it actually was. It was preparation. As his fingers moved across the keyboard, Alexander understood one thing with clarity that surprised him, that this was no longer just about protecting his work or even surviving. Pressure. Whatever came next, Lumir would be the leverage, and he intended to decide how it would be used and when.